She bought a dragon's lair for 85 cents in broad daylight at a royal auction where seasoned treasure hunters with gold pouches heavy at their belts stood silent, watching her bid on what should have been the discovery of a lifetime. But nobody else raised their hand. Seraphina Ravencrest looked around the small crowd gathered outside the weathered stone courthouse of Thornwick Vale, expecting someone, anyone, to challenge her bid. The royal auctioneer's ornate gavel hung in the air, waiting. The ancient cave system sat on 25 acres of mountainous terrain in the shadow peaks, complete with crumbling towers and what local maps labeled as Pyraxis, the Eternal's final sanctum. The entrance needed clearing, sure, but 85 cents for a legendary dragon's lair that had been the subject of countless tales and ballads. The silence stretched longer than it should have, thick as morning mist over a battlefield. Going once, the auctioneer called, his voice lacking its usual booming enthusiasm. Seraphina noticed something else strange. The people weren't looking at the cave entrance visible on the distant mountainside, its massive archway carved into the black stone like a wound in the earth. They were looking at her, not with envy or frustration that a young woman had outbid them, but with something that made her skin crawl beneath her traveling cloak. Pity, deep, sorrowful pity, as if she'd just signed her own death warrant instead of making the smartest purchase of her life. Going twice, an elderly woman named Cordelia Moonwhisper stepped closer to her, gnarled hands clutching a staff topped with raven feathers. She leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper, carrying the weight of decades. You don't want that place, child. Trust an old sage on this matter. There are some doors that should never be opened, some chambers that should remain sealed until the end of days. But before Seraphina could ask why, what terrible secret made an entire crowd afraid of a cave, the gavel came down with a sharp crack that seemed to echo off the surrounding mountains like thunder. Sold to the lady in the midnight blue traveling cloak for 85 cents. The crowd began to disperse immediately, faster than normal, as if they couldn't get away quick enough from what she'd just purchased. Some made warding gestures with their hands, others muttered what sounded like protective prayers under their breath. But as Seraphina approached the royal auctioneer to complete her purchase, she caught fragments of hushed conversations drifting on the mountain wind. Someone should have warned her properly. Nobody's set foot inside for 3 generations. What happened to the last knight-errant who tried? The iron-bound order won't be pleased about this. The auctioneer, a thin man with nervous hands that shook as he handled the official documents, handed her the deed with obvious reluctance, avoiding eye contact entirely. When Seraphina pressed him about the property's history, about why such valuable land had gone for less than a loaf of bread, the man simply shook his head and walked away without another word, as if speaking of it would bring down some terrible curse. That's when Seraphina noticed the most unsettling detail of all. Every single person who had attended the auction was now watching her from a distance. Merchants, farmers, even a few minor nobles. But none of them were moving toward their horses or carriages to leave Thornwick Vale. They were waiting to see what she would do next, as if they expected something to happen, something they'd witnessed before, something that never ended well for the new owner. The ride up the winding mountain path to the dragon's lair felt longer than the 3 hours it should have taken. Every step her black mare took seemed to echo with the weight of those watching eyes from the auction. The higher they climbed into the shadow peaks, the more the very air seemed to thicken with an ancient presence. Seraphina couldn't shake the feeling that she'd made a terrible mistake, but 85 cents for 25 acres of mountain property, including a cave system that legends claimed once housed Pyraxis the Eternal, whose golden scales were said to have been forged in the heart of a dying star, was still an incredible bargain, even if those legends were complete nonsense. The property sat at the end of a treacherous mountain path that wound between standing stones carved with draconic runes that seemed to shift and move when she wasn't looking directly at them. Ancient warning markers, perhaps, or territorial boundaries from a time when dragons ruled the skies and kingdoms paid tribute in virgin sacrifices and stolen treasure. The cave entrance itself was far more imposing than she'd expected from viewing it through the courthouse's brass telescope. A massive archway had been carved directly into the living rock of the mountain, easily tall enough for a dragon to pass through without folding its wings. The opening was flanked by 2 weathered stone statues of armored knights, their faces worn smooth by centuries of wind and rain, but their poses still conveying eternal vigilance, eternal warning. But someone had partially sealed the ancient entrance with newer stonework, as if attempting to keep people out, or perhaps keep something far more dangerous in. Seraphina tied her mare to an iron post that looked suspiciously well-maintained for a supposedly abandoned site, and approached the entrance on foot. Where the original dragon-sized opening had been, someone had installed a heavy oak door reinforced with iron bands. The handle was wrought iron shaped like a coiled dragon, and it turned far too easily, as if someone had been keeping the mechanisms oiled despite 50 years of supposed abandonment. Inside, torchlight flickered from iron sconces mounted along the walls, flames that definitely shouldn't have been burning if the place had been truly empty for 3 generations. The air carried scents of old stone, ancient magic, and something metallic that reminded her of a battlefield after the fighting ended. Her leather boots echoed against polished stone floors as she moved deeper into what had once been the domain of the most feared dragon in recorded history. The main chamber took her breath away. It was a cathedral of living stone, with massive pillars supporting a vaulted ceiling that disappeared into shadows above. Every surface was carved with intricate reliefs depicting the life and conquests of Pyraxis the Eternal, scenes of the great dragon battling armies, accepting tribute from terrified kings, and hoarding treasures beyond mortal comprehension. Ancient tapestries hung between the pillars, their golden threads still gleaming despite their obvious age, showing knights in elaborate armor facing off against a magnificent dragon whose scales seemed to catch and reflect light even in the woven fabric. A raised stone dais dominated the far end of the chamber, where an enormous throne had been carved directly from the mountain itself. The throne was sized for a creature far larger than any human, its arms sculpted to resemble outstretched dragon wings, its back rising to a height that would dwarf even the tallest knight. Scattered around the base of the throne were what appeared to be offerings: ancient weapons, pieces of armor, jeweled chalices, and golden coins from kingdoms that no longer existed. But it was the floor in the center of the main chamber that truly caught her attention and made her heart race with possibilities. The stone tiles were arranged in a perfect circle, clearly different from the rest of the chamber's construction. These stones were darker, almost black, and they'd been cut and fitted with incredible precision to create what could only be described as a massive seal. Not damaged by time or neglect, but deliberately designed and installed to close off access to whatever lay beneath. Seraphina knelt and ran her fingers along the edges where the circular seal met the original floor. The seams were filled with some kind of dark substance that had hardened over the decades. Not mortar, but something that felt organic, almost like dried blood mixed with powdered bone. Someone had gone to extraordinary trouble to ensure this section of floor would never be opened again, and they'd used materials that suggested the sealing had been more ritual than simple construction. Around the circumference of the seal, carved directly into the black stones, were symbols that made her skin crawl just to look at them. Not the decorative draconic runes found elsewhere in the chamber, but something older, more primal. Binding symbols, perhaps, or warnings in a language that predated human civilization. A shadow passed across the cave entrance, interrupting her examination of the mysterious seal. She looked up to see a figure on horseback positioned on a rocky outcropping below, clearly watching the cave entrance with professional patience. Even at this distance, Seraphina could tell the rider was deliberately staying concealed, using the natural rock formations for cover, while maintaining a clear line of sight to anyone entering or leaving the dragon's lair. When their eyes met across the distance, the figure immediately wheeled their horse around and began riding away, but not before Seraphina caught a glimpse of details that made her blood run cold. The rider wore full-plate armor that gleamed like fresh blood in the afternoon sunlight, and emblazoned across the chest was a symbol she recognized from old histories: a black dragon's head surrounded by silver chains, the mark of the Ironbound Order, a militant religious organization that legends claimed had been disbanded 3 centuries ago after their failed crusade against the last of the great dragons. Someone or some group was keeping watch on Pyraxis's lair, had been watching it for decades, possibly generations. The question that sent chills down her spine was simple. Why? What lay beneath that sealed floor that was worth guarding with the dedication of a religious order? And more importantly, What would happen now that someone had finally bought the property legally and discovered evidence of their secret vigil? Outside, she could hear the fading sound of hoofbeats echoing off the mountainside as the crimson-armored watcher rode away. But Seraphina had the distinct and unsettling feeling that the knight wasn't leaving for good. They were leaving to report to someone else that the new owner had found exactly what the ironbound order had been hoping no one would ever discover. Seraphina spent the remaining hours of daylight examining every inch of the main chamber, searching for clues about what might lie beneath the sealed floor. The dragon's lair was clearly much more than a simple cave. It was an engineered marvel, a fortress carved from the heart of the mountain itself. Hidden ventilation shafts ensured fresh air circulation. Channels carved into the stone floor suggested an elaborate drainage system. This had been designed as a permanent residence for a creature that intended to live here for centuries. But the sealed floor remained the most intriguing and ominous mystery. The stonework was clearly much newer than the original chamber construction, probably no more than a few decades old. Someone, within living memory, had carefully sealed away whatever Pyraxis the Eternal had left behind. But why seal it instead of claiming it? Dragons were notorious for their hoards of treasure, magical artifacts, and forbidden knowledge. What could be so dangerous that even treasure hunters wouldn't dare claim it? As she studied the binding symbols carved around the seal's perimeter, a disturbing possibility occurred to her. What if the seal wasn't meant to keep people out? What if it was designed to keep something in? The air in the chamber seemed to grow colder as that thought took hold. She noticed that the torches, which had been burning steadily since her arrival, began to flicker more frantically, as if responding to some unseen presence that her investigation had disturbed. As the sun began to set behind the peaks, casting long shadows through the cave entrance, Seraphina decided it was time to return to Thornwick Vale. She needed supplies if she was going to attempt opening the seal, and more importantly, she needed answers about the ironbound order and why they were so interested in keeping people away from whatever lay beneath her newly purchased property. The ride back down the mountain path felt different in the growing darkness. Where the journey up had been filled with anticipation and excitement, the descent carried an undertone of menace. Every shadow could hide another crimson-armored watcher. Every sound of wind through the rocks could mask the approach of horses carrying knights bent on protecting their ancient secret. The general store in Thornwick Vale was nearly empty when she arrived. Just a few local farmers and an elderly merchant examining bolts of cloth. But the moment Seraphina walked through the door, all conversation stopped. The storekeeper, a middle-aged man with the calloused hands of someone who'd done manual labor before taking up commerce, barely met her eyes as she approached his counter. "I need some tools," Seraphina said, placing silver coins on the worn wooden surface. "A good hammer, stone chisels, rope, maybe some torches." The storekeeper's hands actually trembled as he gathered the requested items. "Planning some construction work? Renovation project. The dragon's lair up on Mount Pyraxis. I purchased it at today's auction." The reaction was immediate and dramatic. Every customer in the store turned to stare at her with expressions ranging from shock to outright horror. A young woman near the herb display gasped audibly and made a warning sign with her fingers. The elderly merchant dropped the bolt of fabric he'd been examining, and it unrolled across the floor like a pool of blood-red silk. That'll be 8 silver pieces," the storekeeper whispered, pushing the tools across the counter without waiting for Seraphina to inspect them, clearly desperate to complete the transaction and have her leave his establishment. As Seraphina gathered her purchases, wrapping the chisels in leather to prevent them from clattering, the store's back door opened with a creak that seemed unnaturally loud in the tense silence. A tall figure in chainmail stepped inside, moving with the fluid grace of a trained warrior. The red and black surcoat he wore over his armor bore the same dragon-head symbol she'd seen on the mysterious watcher, the mark of the ironbound order. "Lady Seraphina Ravencrest," the knight said, his voice carrying the cultured accent of nobility despite the martial bearing. "I am Sir Aldrich Shadowbane of the Ironbound Order. Word travels swiftly in these mountains, especially word of unwise purchases. It seems my business dealings are of great interest to many people today," Seraphina replied carefully, noting how the knight's gauntlet hand rested casually on the pommel of his sword. Not threatening, but ready. Indeed, I'm here to make you an offer that should prove quite profitable. Sir Aldrich's smile was pleasant enough, but it never reached his pale blue eyes. 1,000 gold sovereigns for the mountain property you acquired today. Payment in full, tonight, with a signed transfer of deed. The crash of pottery hitting the floor echoed through the store as the shopkeeper knocked over a display of ceramic jars. The sound was sharp as breaking bones in the sudden, profound silence that had fallen over everyone present. That's quite a substantial profit for a single day's investment, Seraphina observed, fighting to keep her voice steady. One must wonder why you'd pay over 1,000 times what something cost just hours ago. Let's simply say that my order has historical obligations regarding that particular site. Sir Aldrich pulled out a leather pouch that clinked heavily with the weight of gold coins. We've been the guardians of certain secrets for longer than most kingdoms have existed. This purchase would allow us to resume our proper stewardship. Guardianship that includes watching the property from hidden positions? Sir Aldrich's hand shifted slightly closer to his sword hilt, a movement so subtle that anyone without military training might have missed it. We've been keeping vigil over that place for generations, ensuring that nobody disturbs what must remain undisturbed. But now that someone holds legal claim to the land, he set the heavy pouch on the store counter, where it made a satisfying thump. 1,000 sovereigns. More gold than most people see in a lifetime. Final offer. Seraphina looked around the store, taking in the faces of the locals. Every expression carried the same desperate message. Take the money and leave. Take it and never look back. Whatever was sealed beneath the dragon's lair. The entire town knew about it, feared it, and wanted nothing more than for it to remain buried forever. But something in Sir Aldrich's barely controlled desperation told her that knights didn't offer fortunes for empty caves. The ironbound order clearly needed that property very badly, which meant whatever lay beneath the seal was either incredibly valuable or incredibly dangerous. Possibly both. I appreciate the generous offer, Sir Aldrich, Seraphina said, taking a step back toward the store's front door. But I think I'll hold on to my investment for now. Perhaps once I've had time to fully explore what I've purchased, we can discuss terms. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Sir Aldrich's pleasant expression vanished, replaced by something cold and dangerous. Lady Ravencrest, that would be most unwise. Are you threatening me, Sir Knight? I am attempting to save your life. The words hung in the air like the echo of a funeral bell. Every person in the store had gone perfectly still, as if even breathing might trigger some terrible catastrophe. The very shadows seemed to lean in closer, and Seraphina could swear she heard the distant sound of wings beating against the night sky, though that was surely just wind through the mountain passes. But before Sir Aldrich could explain exactly what mortal danger she was supposedly facing, the sound of multiple horses approaching at a gallop made everyone in the store freeze. The rhythmic pounding of hooves on cobblestones grew louder and more urgent with each passing second. Through the store's front window, Seraphina could see 3 riders in full-plate armor dismounting in front of the building. They moved with military precision, their movements coordinated like a well-trained unit. Each wore the same red and black colors as Sir Aldrich, and each kept their hands resting on their weapons as they approached the entrance. One of them, a woman with silver hair visible beneath her helm, looked directly at Seraphina through the glass and gave Sir Aldrich a meaningful nod. Too late, Sir Aldrich whispered, and for the first time since entering the store, he looked genuinely afraid. They know you've seen the seal. The Council of Chains has been summoned. The store's front door burst open, and the 3 armored knights strode inside with the confidence of people accustomed to absolute authority. The first through the door was the silver-haired woman, whose armor bore additional markings indicating high rank within the ironbound order. Behind her came a massive knight whose presence seemed to fill the entire store, and finally, a lean figure whose face was hidden entirely behind a helm shaped like a dragon's skull. Sir Aldrich, the silver-haired woman said, her voice carrying the crisp authority of long command. I trust you've explained the situation to our new property owner? Dame Morwen, Sir Aldrich replied with obvious respect tinged with fear. I offered her the standard compensation. She declined. Dame Morwen turned her attention to Seraphina, studying her with eyes that had clearly seen decades of warfare and darker things besides. Lady Ravencrest, I am Dame Morwen Stormwind, commander of the Northern Vigil. Perhaps Sir Aldrich failed to adequately convey the seriousness of your situation. What situation would that be? Seraphina asked, proud that her voice remained steady despite the overwhelming presence of 4 heavily armed knights in the small store. The situation, said the massive knight in a voice like grinding stone, of you owning property that contains something the world is not ready to face. The skull-helmed knight stepped forward, and when they spoke, their voice carried an otherworldly echo that made everyone in the store step back involuntarily. She has looked upon the seal of binding. She has walked where Pyraxis once ruled. The ancient compact has been broken, and the consequences. The knight paused, tilting their head as if listening to voices only they could hear. The consequences have already begun. Outside, a sound echoed across Thornwick Vale that hadn't been heard for 3 centuries. The distant, unmistakable roar of a dragon awakening from its eternal slumber. Dame Morwen's face went pale beneath her helm as the dragon's roar faded into silence. It's too late, she whispered. The awakening has begun. What awakening? Seraphina demanded, but Sir Aldrich was already pushing past her toward the door. We have to get to the Lair. Now. His earlier composure had cracked completely. If she's broken the outer seals just by being there. The skull-helmed knight spoke in that otherworldly voice. Pyraxis the Eternal was never truly dead, Lady Ravencrest. The ironbound order has spent 3 centuries keeping him in magical slumber beneath your bargain purchase. As they raced through the night toward Mount Pyraxis, Dame Morwen revealed the horrifying truth. The dragon hadn't died in ancient times. He had been deliberately put into an enchanted sleep by the greatest mages of 3 kingdoms, because he was too powerful to kill. The seal of binding wasn't hiding treasure. It was a prison. Every 50 years, the seal weakens, she explained as their horses thundered up the mountain path. The order performs a renewal ritual, strengthening the magic that keeps Pyraxis dormant. But if someone with no knowledge of the binding magic enters the chamber, I've awakened him, Seraphina realized with growing horror. The cave entrance glowed with an eerie golden light when they arrived. The very mountain was trembling, and cracks had appeared in the stone walls of the main chamber. The seal of binding, which had been solid black stone hours earlier, now pulsed with veins of molten gold. How long do we have? Seraphina asked, staring at the deteriorating seal. Minutes, the skull-helmed knight replied. Maybe less. Dame Morwen was already pulling ancient scrolls from her saddlebags. There's one chance. The emergency binding, a ritual that can reinforce the seal, but it requires. She hesitated, looking at Seraphina. It requires the willing sacrifice of the one who broke it. Seraphina felt the weight of the moment crushing down on her. She had bought a dragon's lair for 85 cents, thinking she was getting the deal of a lifetime. Instead, she had unleashed a terror that could destroy kingdoms. The golden veins in the seal grew brighter, and steam began rising from the cracks. Somewhere far below, something massive was stirring, pressing against its ancient prison. There's another way, Seraphina said suddenly, remembering something from her grandmother's old stories. Dragons can be bound by willing contracts, can't they? Not just by force, but by agreement. Sir Aldrich stared at her. You can't be serious. You want to negotiate with Pyraxis the Eternal. Better than dying to keep him asleep. The seal cracked open with a sound like thunder. Golden light poured out, and the temperature in the chamber soared. A voice spoke from the depths. Ancient, powerful, and surprisingly amused. Who dares wake Pyraxis from his long dream? Seraphina stepped forward, her heart pounding. Seraphina Ravencrest. I own this lair legally, and I propose a deal. A massive golden eye appeared in the opening, followed by claws that could tear through castle walls. But Pyraxis didn't emerge. He listened, You interest me, little human. What deal? I'll give you back your freedom, your lair, everything, in exchange for a binding oath that you'll harm no innocent people. Rule your mountain, hoard your treasure, but leave the kingdoms in peace. The dragon was silent for long moments. Then, incredibly, he laughed, a sound like distant thunder. Clever little human, you offer me what those knights never could, respect instead of chains. The golden eye fixed on the iron-bound order. 3 centuries of magical prison because they feared to trust. But you bought my home for 85 cents and offer it back freely. Pyraxis emerged slowly, magnificently, his golden scales reflecting the torchlight like captured stars. He was enormous, ancient, and beautiful in a way that made Seraphina understand why dragons had once been worshipped as gods. I accept your compact, Seraphina Ravencrest. My oath freely given. I shall harm no innocent, threaten no kingdom that threatens not me first. In return, I reclaim my domain and grant you, he paused, considering, a treasure worthy of your wisdom. The dragon breathed gently on a pile of rocks, transforming them into a fortune in pure gold. Your 85 cents have purchased peace between dragonkind and humanity. The first honest deal struck in 3 centuries. Dame Morwen and her knights departed. Their ancient vigil finally ended. The emergency binding scrolls were burned, no longer needed now that Pyraxis was bound by willing oath rather than magical force. Seraphina kept a small portion of the dragon's gift and used the rest to establish a school in Thornwick Vale, teaching negotiation and peaceful conflict resolution. She visited Pyraxis regularly, the two becoming unlikely friends. The dragon's lair remained his domain, but he proved true to his word. Travelers reported seeing him sunning himself on his mountain peak, content at last to rule his territory in peace rather than terror. Sometimes, late at night, Seraphina would think about that moment in the courthouse when she bought a dragon's lair for 85 cents. She'd thought she was getting an incredible deal on real estate. Instead, she'd purchased the key to ending a 3-century conflict and discovered that sometimes the best solution to an ancient problem is simply treating everyone, even dragons, with the respect they deserve. The 85 cents had been the best investment she'd ever made. Not because of the gold, but because it had shown her that courage, wisdom, and a willingness to listen could accomplish what centuries of force could not. If you enjoyed this epic tale of courage, wisdom, and dragon diplomacy, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more incredible stories of ordinary people who changed the world through extraordinary choices. Your support helps us bring you these amazing adventures every week.